All right, we're very glad you could join us today for today's workshop on adapting to climate change. And as you know, as the climate changes, agricultural producers, land managers, citizens will all have to adapt. And the materials that we'll introduce today will get your students thinking about what can be done to adapt to climate change. So just some quick introductions to start us off. My name is Stephanie Hanamato, and today we also have Dr. Steph Bestelmeyer, Kelly Steinberg, and Abby Miller. And all four of us are here from the Asombro Institute for Science Education. You're going to hear from each of us at different points during the workshop. And we're also very happy to have a special expert guest speaker on the call with us today, and we'll introduce him in just a moment. So the Asombro Institute is a nonprofit organization in Las Cruces, New Mexico. We reach more than 20,000 students and 5,000 teachers in southern New Mexico every year through classroom visits, field trips, our free online curriculum, which we're going to be introducing some of you to today, or having a deeper dive with some of the rest of you who have already seen it. And then also teacher workshops, like the one you are experiencing now. And so our specialty is kind of translating scientific research for the classroom. So let's see, can't find my mouse, there it is. So we also have a large menu of remote science lessons for elementary through high school students, and as well as these climate change materials, and you can learn more about all of our offerings on our website. So we're looking forward to sharing some of our climate change lessons with you today. These were developed in partnership with the USDA Southwest Climate Hub, and the Climate Hub understands that preparing for climate change includes educating the future decision makers who are coming up and growing up and becoming old enough to be decision makers about this important issue. And so they decided to prioritize K through 12 education in their outreach efforts. And the Climate Hub does a fair number of different types of outreach. And so these education units that we're going to be talking to you about today are the results of a collaboration that we've had with the USDA Southwest Climate Hub since 2014. And so we're going to talk to you much more in depth about how to access these and show you some of these materials a bit later. So today's agenda, it includes hearing from our guest speaker, Dr. Matthew McIntosh, who we will introduce next, an overview of the climate education resources, like I mentioned, how to access them. And then we'll show you 4 activities and do a quick wrap up. All right, so without further ado, I'd like to pass it over to Steph, who will introduce Dr. McIntosh. I am going to stop sharing my screen.
Great. Well, thank you, Stephanie. So I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Matt McIntosh. He received his PhD from NMSU just a few months ago and is currently working as a research associate at New Mexico State University and is also working with the Southwest Climate Hub. Dr. McIntosh's research is really about grazing and plant-animal interactions on rangelands in the Southwest. He published a great paper a couple of years ago looking at a 50-year data set on temperature, precipitation, and grass production here in the southwestern United States. And so I think he'll probably tell you maybe a little bit about that and some of his other research. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Dr. McIntosh.
Thanks so much, Dr. Bestelmeyer, and it's a pleasure to be here with everyone. I'll share my screen and hopefully you can see that all right. The title of my talk today is Sustainable Grazing Management in the Chihuahuan Desert, with an emphasis on approaches to adapt to a changing climate. And so my research primarily took place in New Mexico, so it's great to see some fellow New Mexicans, but also others from the Southwest. And this is a picture from our research site, which is just north of Las Cruces. And I think this sort of does it justice because it's, you know, such a beautiful landscape, as is our state's motto. This is a satellite view of the research site. This is the New Mexico State University Chihuahua Desert Rangeland Research Center. And so for a little bit of context, you can see sort of the beginnings of Las Cruces in the bottom portion of the screen here. This is sort of upland rangeland, and the whole research site encompasses about 60,000 acres in the northern Chihuahuan Desert, and it abuts the USDA Ornata Experimental Range to the northeast. Today, I'll primarily be talking about this particular pasture in the northwest corner of the screen, which is about 2,500 acres, and that's where all of this data was collected. And depending on the period, the data was collected from. These orange dots sort of represent long-term vegetation plots, where we were able to basically monitor the vegetation year to year, as well as from these blue plots, which represent the rain gauges. So that's how we were able to track precip through time, precipitation. So I didn't get bogged down in the materials and methods too much. Sorry, that's I can talk about that a little bit. There's this research is sort of happening at the confluence of two long-term research projects. So my PhD finished up one long-term study where we evaluated the effects of climate and stocking rates on these grass species. And as part of a larger research effort, which I'll talk about towards the end of the presentation, now we're going to be looking at the effects of different types of cattle breeds, as well as wildlife and climate change on grasses in particular, as well as other plants in the Chihuahua Desert. And so the reason we're focusing, and this talk is primarily about forage production, is because that's the primary animal feed for animals that are on the rangeland. Rangeland, as probably most of you know, encompasses the majority of the Southwest and is characterized by sort of arid environments. And is not particularly well suited for crop production. And so this is where a lot of livestock production takes place. And it primarily takes place as cow-calf production enterprises. So these are farmers who have cows that have calves every year, and then the calves are eventually sold off into more conventional systems like a feedlot where they're finished before being processed for meat. Basically, what we were interested in is looking at these long-term effects of precipitation and climate, because they, if they were or are affecting forage, then it could have a really pronounced effect on the amount of animals that could be raised in this environment. So we basically compared, or one of the comparisons that we did was the first 25 versus the second 25 or 26-year period of this long-term research site. And what we saw was a really big 43% reduction in the amount of forage production in that time period, which is massive. That's nearly half of the forage. And that essentially equates to half of the cows being reduced in the last 52 years. And so that means the bottom line for producers is decreased, but also for society at large, fewer animals can be raised in this environment. And essentially, we think that we're going to need some different strategies to cope with that. This is in addition to a big reduction in the amount of precipitation. Precipitation was reduced by 18% between those two time periods, and also became more variable, which is a common symptom associated with climate change. We're expecting that precipitation regimes will not only become less frequent, but also more variable in their amount and timing. The mean annual temperature increased by almost a degree. It went from 14.4 to 15.3 degrees Celsius. So this is really alarming and telling, and is consistent with other climate models. And the mean annual maximum temperature, which I think is really appropriate to talk about. This data was published from a data set that extended through 2018, but of course in the last couple of weeks we've seen some of these record-breaking heat waves. But the mean maximum temperature, which was increased also about a degree, from 24.5 to 23.3 degrees Celsius. And of course, all of these things are alongside increases in anthropogenic emissions of carbon dioxide. And so while these are the means between those two periods, I think this year rather, we've already exceeded 407 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And that's been basically a consistent trend, since the 1850s. Since the end of the Industrial Revolution. So here's another picture of the research site, and this is data that we garnered from normalized difference vegetation indice metrics. And so basically what that stands for, or what we call that for short, is NDVI. And all you need to know about it is that it's remotely sensed from satellites. And this particular metric will tell us about the relative greenness of the area. And so through various algorithms, we were able to determine sort of the start and end green up dates, as well as other metrics about green up associated with the rangelands. So not only were we collecting plant data on the ground, but also relying on our new technologies, on satellite technology, to sort of inform us about the research area. So one of the things that we saw was that the start green up date between 2000 and 2014, which was the available satellite data to us, which was obviously deployed a bit later than the beginning of the research in 1967, we saw this negative trend, or this trend where the start green up date was becoming later and later in the year. And this was also followed by the end green up date becoming later and later in the year. So one thing that we're sort of always thinking in Las Cruces, or in this area of the Southwest in general, is that monsoon season tends to start around July 4th. Steph and I were talking about that earlier, and this is, I think a lot of people sort of rely on that date to know when rains are going to come. Part of the reason that we think that the green up dates and the growing season dates are becoming later and later in the year, as many people have probably noticed, so have the rains. And so this is also consistent with what the other climate models are saying, where you're having this delay. This is related to a host of sort of more complex climate factors having to do with the increased heat actually causing increased evaporation and not allowing as much rain to fall during these periods, even though the weather patterns might still be sort of pushing these sort of trends. So then additionally, the growing season length has been negatively affected during the same time period. And so we've seen, about a 60% R value where the length of days of the growing season has decreased over the last 15 years. And then also the peak NDVI value. So this is telling us about the relative amount of greenness. And basically what we saw is that the June through September mean maximum temperature, so basically the summertime hot temperatures, have had a really negative impact on the amount of greenness that could be achieved during that period. And so we also looked at just the effects of precipitation overall. We basically found a really strong relationship between the December through September sum total amount of precipitation, which was about 50% related to the amount of forage production that we could that we had. Conversely, though, the amount of forage production was negatively related to the May through September mean maximum temperatures. So as opposed to the previous slide where we were talking about just the previous 14-year period, this is from 1967 all the way to 2018. And when you combine these two things, you basically see this interaction effect where, and this I think might be a little bit expected in some ways, where if you have more sort of annual precipitation and cooler temperatures, you have much more grass production, and conversely, if you have hotter temperatures and less precipitation, you have a lot less forage production. And unfortunately, what we've seen in a lot of this data on this low end of the graph has come from the last 10 or 20 years, where we've seen these increased, especially mean maximum temperatures paired with prolonged droughts. And we're expecting that this trend will continue into the near future, or over the next century at least, especially as temperatures sort of are beginning to exceed this 34 degrees Celsius mark more and more frequently. And so these all have pretty big management implications. Of course, these results, as I mentioned, support a lot of the major climate models, which are showing this increased variability in precipitation, as well as more droughts and more heat waves. And the big takeaway, which I sort of started with, was this major reduction in forage production, over the time of this 52-year time period. So where producers, used to be able to raise, let's say 250 cows in the 1960s, they're already down to 150 cows now, because of this complete lack of forage resource. And then, of course, the growing seasons have become shorter and started to occur later, which is contributing to that reduction in forage production. And then something that I didn't go into a lot of detail, but this is something that we always consider, is that as these climate trends play out, they're probably going to positively affect the amount of shrub production. And this is sort of a negative feedback loop, where if we have more shrubs, their presence is actually going to negatively impact the forage production. And so it's sort of on the cyclical problem. And so all of this has led us sort of this grand hypothesis or way of thinking, which is that the beef production and ranching industry is going to need to rapidly adopt sort of innovative strategies in order to cope with this, with all these deleterious effects of climate change. And so, for instance, here I have an example, which is specialized desert adapted livestock breeds, but I'll talk in the next slide about a couple of other novel strategies as well. So I'm pivoting a little bit here. The Sustainable Southwest Beef Coordinated Agricultural Project is a multi-million-dollar, multi-institutional project, if you will, that's being funded by NIFA, which is a USDA funding agency. And basically it has three research components, some of which I already talked about. These include precision ranching, which is use of sort of smart tools, smart technology, which you might commonly think of as smart appliances, where it's linked to your cell phone and you can turn on your stove from your cell phone, that sort of thing. This is being applied to ranching technologies where you can track cows in real time, for instance. Heritage genetics, which we have a lot of data that suggests that heritage genetics of some particular breeds or biotypes are actually favor sort of our conservation goals, and they could be potentially more sustainable, and especially as these climate change trends play out, as well as supply chain options. So previously I was talking about cows or calves being raised to a certain age and weight where they're going and getting put in sort of a conventional feedlot system and being finished on grain. Some other options might include sort of raising these heritage breeds on grassland and then being able to serve sort of the niche market of grass-fed beef, et cetera. And I like this diagram in particular because it shows sort of the synergy between these three different components of the research as well. So the research is feeding into education, which is the SOMBRO, of course, as well as extension, and all these wheels are sort of turning together, which I think is really nice. So where the research and extension or education tie together, for instance, is a SOMBRO basically taking some of the research that we've learned and being able to increase science literacy among students. And then also, I think the best part is being able to get information from the students to actually feed back into the producers and consumers of tomorrow, to actually feed back into the research. And I think that is like one of the coolest and most novel things about this whole project. Because sometimes we think that researchers tend to sort of function in their ivory tower and are independent. And I think this is really nice that we're able to sort of get the information from the people who it's going to affect the most, and then reincorporate it into the research. And the same goes for extension. So we're not only talking to producers and young producers, but this goes for sort of the community at large, any sort of stakeholders, and that includes the entire American public when we're thinking about sort of all the public land in the West where this beef is being produced. So I'll leave that there, and I'll take any questions. I just want to say one quick thing about this slide. It's like one of my favorite pictures of sort of all of my PhD research, because it ties everything together. Here, this is our primary forage species in the foreground, which is Black Grandma, it's called. This is one of our heritage cows. She's a Raramuri Criollo, and this is a real-time GPS collar that she's wearing that we developed and have been able to track them in real time. So I thought it was like a nice combination of everything. But yeah, I'll open it up to questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. McIntosh. We do have a couple minutes for questions if anyone has a quick question for you.
Well, I have a question. This is
Thank
Susan Niven. I'm not an expert at this, but I have been told that the manufacturer of beef, the feedlots, produce a lot of carbon dioxide. And, you know, the fact that many people who are aware of what's going on attribute some of our climate issues and to that. So I'm wondering, I know you're doing this research, but should we continue? Shouldn't we propose something to the public where meat, and I understand the ranchers have to make a living, but where it becomes less, where we consume less of that?
Susan, I think that's an excellent question. And as somebody in this sort of research realm, it's something I personally like grapple with a lot. You know, it's difficult. You know, I wouldn't say this to a group of producers necessarily, but, you know, like Paul McCartney is sort of advocating like meatless Mondays, for instance. I don't think that that would necessarily impact the beef industry in a super negative way, but it could be sort of a consumer conscious opportunity to reduce the amount of, you know, protein. I mean, Americans are eating way more protein than we need on a daily basis anyway. So I completely agree that it's sort of out of control in that realm. Mm-hmm. Some of the stuff that I didn't talk about is that, you know, there's a lot of these things sort of fill the niches of other aspects of you know, global needs. So for instance, you know, there's a growing global middle class that will require more protein. There's sort of a dwindling workforce in agriculture. So we'll need, you know, hypothetically sort of these smart ranching tools to be able to just facilitate production of animal agriculture at all. There was a third point I was going to make, but anyway, yeah, I think basically our assumption is that all these things will sort of happen in tandem, where I think the individual consumer will probably eat less meat in the near future, but it'll still be a requirement just to feed the, you know, growing human population overall. And you know, if climate change is adversely affecting sort of these massive areas of land and reducing the amount of grazing capacity by 50%, we sort of need, you know, some other way. And especially on rangelands, you know, I think I mentioned a little bit, there's not a lot of other opportunities for sort of arable agricultural ventures. And so even if we could grow crops, we probably can't do it here, and especially not under sort of the projected climate change effects. So I don't know if that answers your question in total, but yeah, I agree with your perspective, certainly.
It's just interesting that you are, you know, we're talking about this in tandem with climate change, because, you know, one of the major, well, maybe not one of the major, but one of the big issues is meat production and feeding these animals and having these animals produce as much carbon dioxide as they do. So that's, I was just, you know, I don't know if there's a solution, particularly now, perhaps down the line, but, and I'm not a vegetarian, by the way, but I have reduced my meat intake due to the fact that I know that A, what we just discussed, and B, it's also not the healthiest thing in the world.
I do have a quick follow-up if I have the time, if the time's available.
We are, I am so sorry,
No,
but
that's fine.
we are running a little bit behind at this point, and I am so grateful for the wonderful discussion. This is really great. But could we please ask folks to make any additional questions to Matt in the chat? And then Matt, if you have time to stick around, would that be okay?
Yeah, I would love that.
All right.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Wonderful. Okay, well, we can't thank you enough for being here today, and I will go ahead and take the screen back. Thanks again. We are very grateful for the insightful talk and the thoughts about how we can use Criollo and other heritage breeds and technology to adapt to climate change. So we wanted to tell you just a little bit about how to access all these materials you're going to learn about today. So we have these three units that we have are organized into modules. However, you can teach the 17 lessons that they contain. You can do those individually or conduct them as a unit. Each of the lessons has an educator guide, a handout, a presentation that goes with it. And several also have instructional videos that will show you exactly how to teach these with your students. Many of these instructional videos also include portions that you can show to your students in case that's easier during instruction. When you access these, the easiest way to do so is to go to asombro.org/climate. And so I'm just going to show you real quick what that page looks like. So that page looks exactly like this. And for example, today we'll be accessing some of the activities from the climate change and the water cycle unit and the effects of climate change on agricultural systems units. So you can just find those on this page, click on the Access Curriculum button. That'll take you to another page that has all of the materials, and there's several different ways that you can access them here. They're organized by suggested groupings. You can look at the entire unit as a complete guide as a PDF. And they're also, all of the resources are listed individually at the bottom of the page. So that kind of just gives you an example of all the different ways that you can access those. And I showed you that really, really quickly, but do not despair. We're going to be sending you a link of all the ways that you can with all of the resources, that we've been talking about today, and you can just click on those you can click on that document to access all of these resources. And with that, I will go ahead and pass it along to Steph, who is going to talk to you about a fun activity called Get Out and Graze.
Hey, thank you, Stephanie. Well, this is a nice follow-up because it's really based on some of the work that now Matt and his colleagues do related to heritage cattle. And this activity is called Get Out and Graze, or Go Ag, and it's part of the climate change on agriculture, the effects of climate change on agricultural systems unit. And you'll notice there, this, like all of our other activities, is aligned with performance expectations from the next generation science standards, like whole performance expectations and or components of all three dimensions. So I've just got those listed here, but that goes for all the activities that you're going to see today and in all of these other workshops. This is a nice follow-up on Susan's question and a lot of questions that we get from students all the time. The global demand for beef is increasing, and the US is actually the top beef producer worldwide. And at the same time, the expectation or the demand for sustainably produced beef, especially here in the United States, is increasing. So ranchers are having to grapple with climate change, forage reductions like Matt showed, as well as this demand for more and more sustainable beef. Beef production is integral to the social fabric of the rural communities in the Southwest and also to the economics of our region. And unlike kind of common wisdom is that most beef is produced in these massive operations, it's actually not true. Most beef cattle operations are actually small operations with less than 50 head of cattle, and most of them are family owned. So disrupting this system means, disrupting both the social fabric and a lot of the economics of the Southwest. So that's kind of additional context that we have to think about all of this within. That cartoon over on the right, it was done by Bob Divins, who's a great local artist. And this is based on the research project, that CAP research that Matt was talking about, where the ranchers and scientists now are kind of using high tech to try to figure out how can we raise beef more sustainably in the Southwest under all of these changing conditions. This is not nearly as good a picture as you saw before of the criollo, but this heritage livestock, it's called the Raramuri criollo. This is what this whole activity, Get Out and Graze, is based on. They were introduced to the Tarahumara in Mexico in the 1600s and had very little crossbreeding. So they've undergone generations, many generations of natural selection in hot, arid conditions, very similar to what we have, of course, here in the Southwestern United States. In 2005, they were brought here to southern New Mexico. And this project, this activity I'm going to show you is actually based on one of the first papers that was done by Raul Painetti and colleagues in 2011. And I'll tell you more about that paper in a few minutes. So the first thing we do in this activity is we have students compare and contrast photos of Criollo versus Angus, and they see right away they're the same breed, they are the same species, and yet there are some pretty massive differences. So obviously the Criollo tend to be much smaller than the Angus. Their bloodlines originated in Africa and then went through Spain into Mexico, and whereas breeds, more traditional breeds like the Angus shown there on the right, their bloodlines came from Europe. So obviously you don't have that selection pressure to be able to withstand the hot, dry conditions that we have here. So after students have learned a little bit about the differences, then we get to play a game. And really the setup for this is quite simple. There are paper bags with labels. You can either handwrite or you can use the labels that are in your teacher guide. Some of the bags are close grazing sites and some are far grazing sites. You'll need pennies to represent food resources. You can pretend it's Black Grandma if you would like. And you'll need something for the students to collect their resources in. It could be something like a cup or whatever else you have around your class. We pretend that the front of the room is where the water is located. So 5 of these close grazing sites are put somewhere close to the front of the room. And then there's 5 of these bags that are arranged in what are called the far grazing sites. The overall structure of the game is that in the first scenario, we pretend that there's abundant resources. So you can imagine we're going back in time, plenty of forage available, and that's represented by 50 pennies or 50 food resources that are randomly distributed within the close grazing sites and 50 that are randomly distributed in the far grazing sites. Then in that scenario, you'll do 2 rounds. You'll have 5 students pretend they're Angus cows. We know from the research, Angus don't like to go very far away from water. They're larger, it takes a lot more energy. This is based on that paper that I showed you as well as subsequent papers. So they're allowed to only go to the close grazing sites. The Criollo, however, go to both close and far, but there is a cost to going far, and I'll show you that in the video in a few minutes. The second scenario is under climate change. And in this case, the initial number of resources is cut in half. And again, you'll have your students do 2 trials. First, they'll be Angus cows, and then they'll be Criollo. There's a 7-minute instructional video, and about 5 minutes of it is set up that you can actually show your students, and it goes through the rules of the game. So if I can get this to come up, we will watch just a couple minutes of this just so you can see how great these videos are. And again, this is something that you could show your students if you don't want to have to explain all these rules. You can let the video do it for you.
Show the rest of the video to students. In this game, you'll represent how different types of cows graze in a desert rangeland. In scenario 1, 5 students will be Angus cows and 5 students will be Criollo cows. 4 students will be food distributors and 2 will be data collectors. 2 students will be location mappers. To start, the food distributors should divide 50 food resources, represented by pennies, among the close sites, and 50 among the far sites. There can be a different number of food resources in each bag. The rest of the class should close their eyes or look away while the food distributors work. Cows will visit one site during each round of the game. Angus cattle are reliant on water and therefore can only travel among the close grazing sites. Criollo cattle are adapted to desert environments and can travel farther from water to find food. A cow at one of the close sites can collect up to 3 food resources per round. There's a cost of time and energy for a cow to move to far sites, so cows at far sites can get a maximum of 2 food resources per round. When you visit a site, reach into the bag without looking and collect the correct number of food resources if there's enough food at the site. Some may be empty. Eat your food by putting them in your rumen. A rumen is a part of a cow's stomach where it begins to digest its food. If there are 2 or more cows at a grazing site, they must take turns getting food resources. If there are no more food resources at a grazing site, the cow must wait until it's time to switch. After a cow has collected food, they mark a dot on the paper next to that site. Angus cows use a blue marker, and Criollo use a green marker. Cows must move to a different grazing site each round, but they may return once they've left it for at least 1 round. At the end of 6 rounds, you'll count how many food resources you've collected. Angus cows are trying to collect 10 food resources by the end of the 6-round trial, and Criollo are trying to collect 7. If they don't, the rancher will need to supplement their diet with hay or other foods, which costs more money. Angus cows will go first.
All right, we'll end it there, but you can certainly have your students watch the rest of that just so they can see all the rules of the game. So after your students play the game, and the game itself only takes 10 to 20 minutes, depending on how quick your food distributors are, there's 2 types of data that come out. The first one are those location maps. And so when your cows go to each of these sites, they put a dot on that location map. And then you'll put them all together. And we intentionally put this pasture to kind of mimic the size and shape of the pasture that was used in the research study. So here's the water. These maps over on the right, in the middle on the right, are from the research paper. And so these are based on those GPS collars that were put on cows that identify where they were located within the pasture. And you'll see that we modeled the game to mimic what really is happening out in pastures. So here in the middle, in the blue, this is the Angus, and you can see they mostly stay very close to the water source. And the Criollo also spend a lot of time near the water, as you can see here on the right, but they also will visit farther areas of the pasture and therefore be able to access some food that probably the Angus can't. So this just shows that our model in our game kind of works. It works like the real cows work. The data that are collected are relatively simple. So I'm showing you here the data tables and the data from our limited resource trial. So this is when there's only 25 resources put in the close grazing sites and 25 in the far, so 50 total. So you'll notice here on the left, here's our Angus, and these cows, we had 5 cows out in our herd at the time, and they collected anywhere from 1 to 11 food resources. Our Criollo in their trial collected anywhere from 6 to 11 in their trial. And then what you can have students do is go through the math. And we're actually going to do this in breakout rooms just so you can interact with each other a little bit in a few minutes. And The calculations are quite simple. So if you are in one of the odd numbered breakout rooms, and you'll be just randomly assigned, then please start with the Angus calculations over here. If you're in an even numbered breakout room, please start with the Criollo over on the right-hand side. And you're really going to be filling in 4 things. So you're going to make a total number of resources by just adding up all of these resources here. That same number you put down here under total and then do the math to figure out the total percent of the resources that were consumed by the herd. Then you'll follow the directions to figure out the mean number of resources per cow and put it into this box here. And then the last box is the number of cows that needed supplemental food. And so remember, it's a little bit different. It's 10 resources or less if you're on the Angus side, and it's 7 or less because Criollo are smaller, so they don't need as much food overall on the right. So you'll go to your breakout room. You'll have 5 minutes. They're fairly simple calculations. So you can all say hi to each other and be sure to open the Google link that you'll see in the chat in just a moment. Click on the folder for your breakout room. So note which room you are in, and then open the Get Out and Graze document. You'll see some other folders in there for some activities we'll do later. Fill in those 4 text boxes that I showed. If you click on the Google document, you'll see a text box and you can just type in your number. After 5 minutes, you'll come back and we'll fill this all in, both Angus and Criollo tables in together. All right, welcome back, everybody. I hope you understood the directions. The math is not that hard, but maybe sometimes the directions are. So this is, let's not do a Ferris Bueller moment. Please, when I ask for any of these answers, just call it out, or you can type it in the chat. We're going to go through these pretty quickly so that we can see the results. So we're going to start with Angus. So, all right, get ready, all of you odd numbered breakout rooms, 1 through 5. What'd you get? All right, so first up, the total number of resources collected by the Angus.
I'm sorry, you know what? My connection's not letting me stay on the meeting, and I'm sorry, that's why I keep on having to come back in.
Oh,
So
that's
I apologize,
okay.
you have to keep on letting me in.
No problem. There's plenty of us. It's easy for us to click. Don't worry at all.
Thank you.
I heard an answer too. Did I hear an answer?
25.
25, absolutely. So then we take that 25, we pull it down into here because that was our total consumed, divided by the 25 that we had, multiply by 100 to give us a percentage. And what percentage of the total resources were consumed by the Angus?
100.
100, yeah, not a good situation, but yes, 100% in this round of the game. The mean resources per cow, and you'll notice that the instructions are always written here for the student. So it's the total resources, or 25, divided by the number of cows you had, in this case, 5. So what is 25 divided by 5?
5.
You got it. They each, on average, got 5 resources per cow. And then how many of those Angus would need supplemental food? So how many of them got 10 resources or less? 4, absolutely. So only this cow 5 would not need the supplemental food. Great, so let's move over to Criollo and then we'll compare. So total number of resources collected by our Criollo. What'd you guys get? Even numbered breakout teams?
Put it in the chat too.
All right, we can do it together. 11 and 9 is 20, plus 8 is 28, plus 10 is 38, plus 6 is?
44 says the chat.
All right, thank you, chat. All right, so we've got 44. We're going to take that and put it down here, just like we did before. So what total percent of the resources did our Criollo consume? So it's 44 divided by 50 times 100. It's 88%. All right. And then how many mean resources per cow? So there were 5 cows and they collected a total of 44. Did anybody do the math?
Miss Hagel did. She said it's 8.8.
All right. 8.8 grasses per cow, resources per cow, and how many of those criollo would require supplemental food? Remember, anybody who gets 7 or less requires supplemental food. How many is that?
Just one.
Just the one, right? So just this cow number 5, all the rest of them would be okay. So this is very typical data that we get when we do this with students. So the Angus don't always collect all of those because it just depends which grazing sites they go to, but they're usually pretty high. So really what this means is a rancher would actually move their cows to a different pasture well before they got to 100%. But again, that takes time and energy, money for the rancher to invest in moving the cows, whereas the criollo could stay in the pasture for longer. You'll notice that even though the criollo need less, they actually were able to get more because they were able to use more of that pasture, even though there was a time and energy cost to them going to the further sites. And very importantly for the ranchers, they would need to supplement the Angus in this situation with limited resources, which is unfortunately what we're moving into more and more on ranches in the Southwest. They would have to buy cottonseed cake or hay or some other supplement that's really expensive in order to allow them to still raise cattle on their land. So that is our Go Ag, or Get Out and Graze activity. And all the other activities you're going to see today are based on cropland agriculture. But we thought it would be nice for you to get a little taste of rangeland agriculture and some of the adaptations, such as the use of heritage cattle that ranchers are thinking about and researching in order to adapt to a changing climate. And thanks, and I'll turn it over to Abby.
I have a question though. Wouldn't you need for food production, meat production, more I can't say more of the small cows?
Yeah, that's a great question, Susan. That's one of many issues, including, they're smaller. So the traditional beef production system is not really set up for these smaller cows. You might have noticed they have horns, and the traditional beef supply chain is not really set up for cows with horns. So all of this is part of that research project that Dr. McIntosh was talking about. So excellent question. And yes, you're right. There's trade-offs certainly associated with criollo too.
Thank you.
So like Steph just said, that lesson in Get Out and Graze is focusing on livestock production and adapting to climate change. The rest of the lessons we're going to talk about today are going to focus on crop production. And this one, called Farms on the Table, talks about how farmers can adapt crop production to changing climate conditions. And if you were here at the workshop last Monday, we talked about a lesson called Interacting Adaptations, which might have introduced you to some of these adaptations. Farms on the Table takes us a step further, and we start thinking about costs. And are these adaptations worth the cost? And really thinking about the Southwestern climate specifically, and what changes are expected to occur here. So in this lesson, students are going to be running an imaginary farm, and they're going to be responsible for sort of planning out their farm each year. So they're going to choose some climate mitigating adaptations at the beginning of the game to install on their farm kind of permanently. And then they're going to think about what planting practices and what crop treatments they could do in their farm for each year. And they're going to play the game for 6 years. Each year, you're going to reveal weather conditions that affect the financial returns of these adaptations for each year. So students are farmers adapting to climate change, and their goal is to keep their farm in the black or making money. So the first thing they're going to do is they're going to choose their farm's location. They're going to choose from one of these 5 Southwestern states, and they can choose this based on which one is closest to them, and they can see what the projected future temperature and precipitation is going to be like in these locations. So that can kind of inform them on what their farm is going to be like in the future with climate change. So we see we have increasing temperatures in all of these counties. And then we also have some increases in precipitation, but not as significant as the temperature impacts.
So then they're going to customize their farm with climate mitigating adaptations. So these are two examples. This one is hedgerows, where farmers will plant a row of wild shrubs or trees that border their fields. And this one is water cistern collection and storage units. So a way to collect water for their crops. And the PowerPoint slides that you'll have access to will go over in detail all of these adaptations. So you don't actually have to be an expert in knowing what all these adaptations are to guide students through this process. And you'll see the pros and the cons of each one of these adaptations. And the associated costs of each one. So they'll pick their climate mitigating adaptations. They can pick as many as they want to start out, and they'll write the cost of each one that they chose in this chosen costs column. Then they'll calculate the total cost. So this is the starting output factor of their farm. So just based on these climate mitigating adaptations that they have installed on their farm. So they'll calculate the starting output factor based on that. And that is the number that they are trying to keep positive. They're trying to keep that number above 100 during the game. So then each year they're going to choose at least 2, they can choose more than that, of planting practices and or crop treatments to apply on their farm. And then they will write the chosen costs of each one of those for that year. So in this example, I chose a flood-resistant crop variety, and I chose to apply fungicide to my crops that year. And then they're going to roll a die for each practice and treatment that they chose, and they're going to write that number in the die roll column at the end right here. And then you'll use the PowerPoint to reveal the weather conditions for that year. So this is a screenshot from the first year of weather, and it tells us that the weather was historically normal that year. So based on the weather each year, some of the investments that they chose are going to be positive and some are going to be negative. So for example, this one, I chose a flood resistant crop variety, and with historically normal weather, there was no flooding that was occurring that year. So that planting practice would be a negative investment that year because I just spent a bunch of money buying these new plants, and there wasn't even a flood to have to adapt to. So they'll write whether their investment or whether their practices were positive or negative, and then they will calculate that output change total. They'll also get bonus points for some of the farm adaptations that they implemented at the beginning of the game. Maybe some of them are going to be higher adaptation bonus points than others, depending on the weather for that year. So there's all kinds of different weather conditions in the game. There's drought, there's a heat wave, there's a windy year, increased precipitation year. So they're really thinking about these adaptations under a variety of weather conditions. So they'll calculate the starting output factor for each year, and they'll do this game for 6 years under all these different conditions, following all those different steps. And then they'll think about what practices and treatments were positive more often and which ones were negative investments more often. And they'll really start thinking about why that was the case. So for example, buying flood-resistant crop varieties and applying fungicide are not usually going to be positive investments in the Southwest, because while we are expected to get seasonal changes in precipitation, we're not actually expected to experience a bunch of flooding that would require these adaptations. So that's an example of one of the conclusions that they'll come to by playing this game. And I know that was a super fast overview, but there is an instructional video for this game as well that will walk you through the steps for every single year of playing this game with students. So a really helpful resource to watch that video if you're going to play this game with students. Does anybody have any questions about Farms on the Table? Awesome. All right, so I'm gonna pass it over to Stephanie, who's gonna talk about another really cool experiment.
All right, thank you, Abby. And yeah, she's right. So this is a neat activity to talk about next because it is an experiment. Don't get the impression that all of the activities within these modules are games, because there's a lot of variety of different types of activities. So in this experiment, students construct a model, a climate change adaptation, namely shade structures. So this lesson addresses the phenomenon, can a shade structure prevent crops from wilting? So a central concept in this lesson for students to grasp is transpiration. So as you may know, transpiration is the escape of water from inside plants into the atmosphere. It serves to help plants control their temperature through evaporative cooling and to enable the flow of water and nutrients from the soil. It's an invisible process. You can't really see it, so it's hard to explain to students, but you can tell them that if you put a bag over the leaves of a plant, then you can see the bag fog up, demonstrating that the transpiration is occurring, that water is escaping from inside those leaves. The water escapes from tiny pores on the leaves called stomata. The singular is stoma. And transpiration is affected by a lot of environmental factors, and that can include things like temperature, light, humidity, wind, carbon dioxide, soil moisture. And as these famous graphs show, you know, on the right here, these we know that with climate change, we've experienced increase in average global temperature and carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So in this lesson, we'll focus on how these increases in temperature and carbon dioxide will affect transpiration. And there are likely connections between climate change and other factors on this list as well, but we'll focus on these two. So like I mentioned a moment ago, an adaptation to using to growing crops in the heat is our shade structures. So to avoid having too much transpiration happen and letting their crops get wilted, some agricultural producers use shade structures as an adaptation. So they've been used experimentally in several crops, bell peppers, tomatoes, cherries. And what researchers have found is that the use of these structures has resulted in a decrease in temperatures under the structure and an increase in crop yields. They're being used in practice as well. I was delighted to take that bottom photo from my car as I was driving near Salinas, California last week. This producer was using shade structures on a large field of some type of berries. It was hard to tell at 70 miles an hour. In this lesson, students model shade structures and conduct an experiment to test how effective they are at keeping leaves from transpiring too much and wilting. Students work in groups of 3 to 5, and the nice thing about this experiment is it requires really simple materials, like all Climate Hub lessons, just some paper plates, some lights, some soda cans, scales of some sort. If you have electronic balances, that's great, but you don't have to, and some spinach from the grocery store. Now, what happens is, well, I should say that if you have an hour or less, we recommend that you do some preparations for the experiment. So if your class is like an hour or less, we would recommend that you prepare the shade plates in advance and not have the students do it. And that involves just cutting those holes that you can see in that bottom left photo. You can see the plate on the right has some holes cut in it. And also pre-weighing approximately equal amounts of spinach on 2 plates for each group. Again, you don't have to remember this. There are detailed instructions for how to do this in the teacher guide, and there's an instructional video, a really great instructional video for this lesson. So at the beginning of the experiment, students record the mass of each treatment, 1 plate that's left open and 1 plate of spinach that's put under the shade structure. And then they put them under lights and turn the lights on at the exact same time. Once it's set up, this experiment has to sit for 30 minutes or more. So while this experiment is sitting and the treatment is being conducted, students play this game called Don't Be a Loser. So while students wait, we want them to explore this idea of water escaping from a leaf a bit more. So they're going to explore transpiration through this game. And in a couple minutes, we'll be inviting you to try it. You're going to go real quick to a breakout room with one partner. You're going to try a modified virtual version of this game. Students actually play this with real cards, but you're going to be playing it with a Google Slides version. So there's printables available in the lesson for this. The premise of the game is that we know in reality that climate is changing and we're seeing increases in carbon dioxide and temperature, but there's a little science fiction in the game as well. We're going to pretend that you or the students when you're back in your class, but you in this case are a miniature farmer. And for 9 days, every day at noon, you're going to go visit the same stoma on a tomato leaf. You're going to make note of whether that stoma is open or closed. You're also going to note the relative temperature. This information is going to be found on those game cards that I mentioned. So you don't have any cards in front of you. Again, you're not together. So you're going to play this with a Google Slides version of this game just for you to get a taste of it. So when you get to your breakout room, same thing, you're going to note which breakout room you're in, and then there will be a folder with the corresponding breakout room number. You'll click on your folder, and inside that folder there's a file called Don't Be a Loser, and it will look like this. So slide 1 has some instructions. You'll open it up, read the instructions on slide 1. You don't have to memorize them. There actually is an abbreviated version of the instructions on the next slide, the game slide, which is slide 2. You'll take turns with your partner. Look at the cards that are labeled A, one at a time. It doesn't matter what order you go in. Record the relative temperature difference from the A card in the table. Again, there's a text box that you can click in on the table that will allow you to enter that temperature difference, and then delete the A card, and you'll reveal that there's a B card underneath. So when you look at that B card, you're going to see how many water points you gained or lost. And then you will record your water points gained or lost in the table. Again, there's a little text box that you can click. You'll add up the points, complete the little subtraction problem at the bottom of the slide, and we'll give you maybe about 5 minutes to play around with this game, and then we'll bring you back. So you'll see that there's going to be a Google folder link that's going to pop up in the chat. Excuse me, I did not mean to go forward. I told you the answer. And then you'll be sent to your breakout room. So please click on that breakout room link once you receive it. All right. Welcome back, everyone. Thanks for trying it. Did anyone get to solve the subtraction problem at the bottom? And if you did, could you please let us know whether the net water points were positive or negative? And I can't see the chat.
Kathy says, yep, that's what we got.
Okay, so I do have the answer there, and my very observant students notice that it does say that it's negative. So that means that the leaf is actually going to be losing more water than it can serve. So the leaf would get wilty in this situation, right? So then you bring the students back after playing that game and revisit the shade structure model and experiment. So they record and analyze the results of their spinach experiment. They use the starting and ending mass to calculate the percent change in both the open and the shade treatments. And then on the board or a document camera, you can compile the percent change for each treatment, and the students will calculate an average. So then they'll notice that in their spinach, what they'll see is that the open treatment does transpire more and lose more water to the atmosphere and get more wilty. And so then they examine the implications of their results for crops. All right. And thank you very much for trying that game out. I know you didn't have very much time, but you'll have much more time in class. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen and pass things over to Kelly, who's going to tell you about one more fun activity.
All right. Great. Yeah, so I'll just give a reminder. I know we've covered a lot of stuff already, and you had just a little time in that breakout room. So we just are hoping we give you a little taste of these activities, so that you're interested and you remember it later when you need something in your classroom to talk about different topics. So Ready, Set, Grow is the last lesson we'll take a peek at today. This is a lesson from the water module or the water cycle unit, sorry. And it is about, it fits in really well with what we just talked about with will to be productive. So you as scientists and teachers know that plants need two big resources to survive and do photosynthesis, and that is carbon dioxide and water vapor. And carbon dioxide and water vapor go in and out of the stomata. So as we think about those stomata that you were just looking at in Don't Be a Loser, that's what's, or the water vapor was escaping, but they have to be open for the carbon dioxide to get in. So this lesson asks the question, how do changes in temperature and carbon dioxide affect plants? And students do that by playing a game to model transpiration and plant resource use over a period of time, a long period of time under climate change. So under an increasingly hotter climate and increasingly more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, what does that mean for plants? And so for this, you have students acting as the plants. You have the drought-tolerant plants and the water-intensive plants, and the resources they need to survive, which are carbon dioxide and water that these cards you scatter around the room. And then I have another video to show you today. So this is the instructional video. I'll just show you a minute or two of this, so you can see the students playing the game.
At the end of each round, all plants must transpire 1 water point back to the environment. To survive, drought-tolerant plants must have 2 remaining water cards and 2 carbon dioxide cards at the end of the round after transpiration. Water-intensive plants must have 4 water cards and 2 carbon dioxides for survival after transpiration. Educators should emphasize to students that in real life, plants will obviously not be moving around for their resources, but students are acting as their plant's roots and leaves, seeking out the resources they need. Once students understand the resources they need to survive the round, the educator will say, ready, set, grow, and release students to gather resources scattered throughout the classroom.
Have students transpire 1 water card back into the environment. Determine which plants have gathered enough resource cards to survive this round. All students will return their resources back into the environment. Students who did not survive will proceed to the back of the sprout line. Surviving plants will be provided a matching name tag to give life to the next sprout in line, increasing their plant population. Students are ready to start the next round.
All right, I'll stop it there. So as students play this game, they collect their data, but at each round, as a class, you graph the data of how much water, how much carbon dioxide are in the environment, and how many of each type of plant. So you have a graph that'll look something like this over the course of the game. And you'll see carbon dioxide increasing. Each round, we add more carbon dioxide to the atmosphere to represent a new time period with higher CO2 levels. And we decrease water because we know here in the Southwest, as we get hotter, there's gonna be less water available because increased evaporation. But also throughout that time, as it's getting hotter for the plants, they're transpiring more. So this plants need to use more water. So students have to put back an extra water card each time. Round 2, they put back 2 water cards. Round 3, they put back 3 water cards. And you can see which of these resources really are the limiting resources for the plants, and which plant populations are going to respond, which one's going to respond quicker, which is of course the water intensive plants. So this game is really trying to model change over time within the environment affecting populations. And you can also take time with this activity to talk to the students about, this is a model. How is this model accurate? How is this model showing our environment? I always like to ask the question when I'm using models of challenging students to make our model more accurate. What could we do to make this really match what we see in the environment? And so those sorts of things will help students really think about what are we trying to show, and what are we showing kind of out of convenience, and what are we showing to match what we see in the world. So that's a really quick introduction to Ready, Set, Grow. It's a quick and easy game to play. It doesn't take too long, but you can stretch it out and play it for many, many rounds unless all your plants die. And then you start over and do it again and see if you get the same results. Or you can do it pretty quickly if you have just a little bit of time. So it is almost 5:30 and we're going to wrap it up here. This is, for many of you, this is day 3 of our 4 series. So thank you for everyone who's come. You've seen now lessons from all 3 of these units. For anyone who's new today, these lessons are coming from our 3 units online: the water cycle, agricultural systems, and the carbon cycle. We've got a new lesson that'll go up sometime in the next few weeks about water conservation in the Southwest called Where's Our Water? And then in 2022, we'll have climate change and wildfire, 3-lesson unit coming out on that. And the water conservation data jam will be coming out as well, which is a big unit helping students interpret water data from across the Southwest, and interpret it, communicate it, and figure out how to act on that, on the data that how to act on what they've learned from the data. So that's will be coming out. You can check back at asombro.org/climate to see that. That is all we have for today, but we do have kits to give away. We have kits for the Wilt It Be Productive lesson that Stephanie just talked about, with all the supplies you need to put that lesson together, as well as we have game kits for Ready, Set, Grow. And we would love to give those away and get them out of our office and get them to you. So Abby just put, oh, and Get Out and Graze. We have the materials for the Get Out and Graze game too. So Abby just put the winner in chat, and let her know send her a message with your mailing address, and we will get those to you. And last but not least, it is really, really helpful for us if you can fill out an evaluation form. And I know we've asked people for these at the end of every workshop. We're going to ask a couple more times. Really important to us to get those. And then we hope to see you all back here on Wednesday at 4 o'clock for our last in this cycle, as well as future workshops. So we love to connect with you all. Stay in touch. Come back and see us again Wednesday or beyond. If there's any questions, we'll stick around. Let us know.